All right, well, you got to see what happens when your producer gets a job, real job.
We're really ready. We just wanted to see if y'all could get rattled up.
Hold on a
Put the
second.
microphone on.
Yeah,
We're professionals, real professionals.
we're literally getting ready to go, and realize we don't have any microphones on. Nobody's gonna be able to hear us. Hey guys, welcome back. Hey, would you go turn that big light off over there?
Oh,
It's gonna shine off the top of my head.
we can't have that.
Left, one on the left. Ah, there we go. All right, man, we're a little discombobulated today. How you doing, Tim? Tim's got his beautiful legs on for us today.
Yeah, today's been a day.
As always, though, if you're out there and watching, we'd love to know that you're watching. Feel free to comment, all those things. I'm trying to run the stream as well today, so I guess it's going to be permanent. So you're going to have to really pick up, Tim, and really, your thing's on backwards, by the way. Your microphone's on backwards again.
That's right. We've had this conversation.
We have had this conversation. Can y'all imagine turning on the evening news and finding us? A bunch of bumbling
Today's been
idiots.
discombobulated all morning, so I could give you a whole string. It's been one of those days so far, and it's not even halfway through.
We are gonna be talking about 1 Corinthians 14.
Well,
What were you saying a while ago? Go with what you were saying a while ago before we got on the air and kind of set it up for us.
So, yeah, we talked about 13 and 14 kind of together, and didn't read a whole lot out of it. We did in 13, but anyway, looking at that bigger picture as we pan back out of it was that he's starting to go into something talking about gifts in particular, which is something people spend a lot of time looking at and trying to narrow down based off what Paul says, how it's supposed
Right.
to walk, talk, and act. But his whole context of all of it had nothing to do with the gifts necessarily.
Right.
He was just saying, this is what you're doing, and you're pursuing these things, and in wrong motive, more or less. And I'd stop short of saying evil, but they were pursuing these things. And he says you can have all these great things and gifts, but it's love you need to pursue. And then he says at the end of it that all these gifts in 14, he says or in 13, he says all these gifts are going to go away because they're just here to edify the church, and the only thing left is going to be love, hope, and faith.
Right.
That goes on forever. We'll have that when we're in the face of the Father. And so he's trying to draw that conclusion. So we're going to go back a little bit into 14 and actually read through some of the gift function he's talking about to kind of talk about the gifts, but to keep the overall function of what he's trying to get through there on it, if that makes sense.
It does make sense to me. We how do I want to say this? I'm trying to
Well, I don't know. Human nature to me is you're doing the church world, and you're doing the thing, and Baptists are boring for the most part, and so.
hey.
And I've been in many places in the world and watched many different Baptists, so to speak, and been in a lot of Pentecostal places. So that's the polar opposite. And when I say Baptists are boring, Baptists, boy, this is really going to sound bad, but we're kind of like the Pharisees, not in the sense of the bad
Ouch.
Pharisees, but they studied the Word. Jesus even told them, you think you find eternal life in your knowledge of these scriptures. And you're missing the whole point of what the scriptures are saying. And so the Baptists are truth people, right? In general. And I had a really big mentor of mine one time say that when he needs to hear truth, he goes to hear the Baptists. When he needs healing, he goes and see the Pentecostals.
Ouch.
Well, because one puts more emphasis on one side and the other one puts emphasis on the other. And that's actually kind of a good picture of what Paul's trying to say. You can't have one without the other.
Right.
And the other one may not be natural to you, so you can't dismiss it or gaff it off or whatever. You just have to accept it for what it is. And because if you don't, there are such things as healings. There are such things as I've seen a lot of things. I've never seen anybody raised from the dead, but I've seen somebody that was
Me neither.
heavily, deathly ill get up and start walking.
Well,
And those things are not natural to my upbringing and how academically I'd been proposed to the word. Some of the things we talked about, we try to dismiss these things. They're not around anymore or whatever. Well, they are around.
well, and I think, and I grew up in an environment that would also have told you that the apostolic gifts died out when the apostles died. They were the only
Yeah,
only
and that's
ones
what
that-
I was talking about.
And I do want to address that a little bit. I mean, I'm not purporting to do any kind of a serious exegetical, breakdown or whatever into everything, but at the same time, I'm trying to parse my words on the fly here. You can tell. Before we get into really talking about the gifts, there's a big portion of the church, the body of Christ, that's really wound up tied around the axle about whether or not these things actually even still exist. And we've got to touch on that, I think, a little bit. And because there's if you want the big fancy words, the two groups are cessationists, which they believe they've ceased, or continuists, or continuationists, however you choose to say that made up word. And is people that just believe that they're still going. I grew up in that world. You were saying that's where you grew up too, kind of, right?
Yeah, but even so, the way you describe it, that's in the theological, heady people that, well, I'm not mocking it. What I'm saying is that I think especially today, when you walk in really any church, unless you don't find as many people or places or churches that are just heavily making a big deal out of you got to have gifts or you don't have gifts. I think we've run into, and how I guess I'm seeing this is that we run more into places where they're kind of ignored because nobody really understands them anymore.
Well, I'm going to push back a little bit because
I would say it's ignorance more than what, anyway.
Yeah, but 15 years ago, I would say
Yes,
we saw more absolutely not or absolutely so.
completely agree.
Two camps. I think now there's three camps. I think there's absolutely not, absolutely so, and we have no idea, so we ignore it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And there was, back in the day, in the day, there was a book that came out by Hank Hanegraaff, you might remember, The Counterfeit Revival. And there was this thing that happened, and I don't remember when you could say it started with Azusa Street and all that, but there was a counter movement that started that I kind of came up hearing about, and I'm not even like from my ultra fundamental upbringing, but even from like when I was over in the Southern Baptist Church as a young adult.
Yeah.
There was this big swing against the charismata and the charismatic movement, as it was called, word of faith. And you know what? There's some legitimacy to some of that. There was crazy stuff. Even practicing charismatics now talk about the crazies in their own group. Slapping people with jackets, and there's memes now, and
there's memes and videos all over the place.
and there was a swing against that.
Yeah.
That went ultra, these don't exist, because nobody there for a while, nobody wanted to be even remotely associated with that weird bunch.
Yeah.
And so there was this, not just an ignoring of the gifts, but there was actually a pronouncement against them.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And it really began to concrete this doctrine of the gifts are gone. The gifts are gone. And I would always ask, why would you tell me that the gifts were gone? I basically got two answers. And the two answers that I received growing up were, one, only the apostles did it, and they're all dead. And two, it all stopped when the canon was complete.
Yeah.
I'm not going to, maybe on a different show. Okay. I'll go to the second one first, but when the canon, because the scripture says that when that which is perfect has come, these will pass away. You got to make like Olympic level gymnastic flips and movements to make that text say that it's talking about the completion of the canon.
Yeah.
Frankly, you can't do it. End of story. We'll discuss it one other day. As to the first one of the things that caused me personally in my walk, early on in my walk with the Lord as an adult, to have a crisis of faith, now they would say it would be a healthy version of deconstruction. Okay, because I had to peel apart, I was so adamantly, and my parents didn't really, wasn't from them, it was from the cats that I was listening to out in the world, in the tradition, the ultra conservative fundamental tradition, were just pounding this idea. It was with the apostles. Now it was accepted in the local groups that I was in, but it was accepted because it was preached by people they respected. And I don't fault them for that.
We touched on that whole thing earlier on. So yeah.
And so, but when I started studying in the scriptures and I found other people that weren't apostles doing signs, wonders, and miracles, that was the crisis of faith for me. Because if somebody tells me my whole life, only this select group of 12, 13 if you count Matthias, 14 if you count Paul, only that bunch gets to do the miracles, has the gift of healings, has the gift of whatever. And then all of a sudden you see this story about Stephen, who was out in the church doing gifts, miracles, signs, and wonders, and you start to see it in other places.
Well, yeah, there's the 75 that went out with no names on them.
Yeah, we don't know who they are.
And half of them fell away later on, but yet they were out doing that.
Exactly. And so those are the things like they are literally two mutually exclusive truths. And so I had to come to a place to where there was a push. And I see it now even culturally. Are you in this camp? Are you in this camp?
That is most definitely still around.
That's still around, and
but it's from an ignorant position.
I believe it is from an, and I don't mean, we don't mean that in a negative way. It means, I just think that there's just, I tend to more take the stance now when I encounter things that maybe I don't understand or can't explain or whatever, and somebody asks me questions, I give the answer, it depends a lot.
Yeah.
Because Paul's doing that in 1 Corinthians. When they're asking him questions, well, it depends.
I'll even say, I have no clue.
Yeah. Well, and I actually was telling a guy yesterday, I was in a conversation yesterday, about, because I just adopted the idea that no one has the gift of healing. Now, I never believed that God didn't heal.
Yeah.
That's different, but I just didn't believe in the gift of healing. But as I studied the scriptures, they're kind of one and the same, except some people tend to be able to do it together or to do it better. But then you get into James 5. What are you supposed to do if you're sick? Call the elders of the church together. They anoint you with oil. They pray the prayer of faith. And then it says you'll be forgiven of your sins.
Yes.
And so there's this idea of healing. Well, the first time we did that, somebody asked us to do it. I've told the story before. This lady got healed of a brain tumor or of a tumor. And, it just happened, and I've seen it happen since.
Yeah.
I've seen stuff in third world countries like you've talked about before, and I'm not one for you'll never want to toss this book out. It is the final authority, but we also have to. Blackaby would tell you your circumstances and the things around you help you to see and experience God. And so as we get into 1 Corinthians 14, I just want to go on record, as it were. Because it's weird because in the last 2 weeks, this has come up in just random conversations, because I kind of came out of a world, and I'll use the phrase grew up in a world, but it really is a world that I helped create for myself, which was if you believe in the gifts, then you're automatically liberal and you're on the path to nutdom. You're just going to be crazy soon and be slapping people with your white jacket. That's just not where I land. I believe in the Holy Spirit. I believe in the gifts of the Holy Spirit. I believe in Ephesians 4, where it talks about the gifts that God gave us to the church, apostles, prophets, teachers, pastors, those things. I believe he gives us gifts to use it for the edification of the church, but to also continue to validate the message and point to Christ. I mean, is that a fair stance for you to jump on board with?
No, that is a fair stance. And we talk a lot about human nature here. And I think what happens is, and this, it's relevant to what we're fixing to read here and what Paul is dealing with here. So the truth seekers, and I'm talking about maybe the academic truth seekers, they'll say people, and part of it's true. So you have two sides of the camp, right? And I would say natural sides of the camp, and I mean natural in a good sense, in terms of some are more analytical minded, and they pursue that, they look for that, they can put things together, and it seems like what would be what we might call common, but you also got to remember common sense and what common sense is in the kingdom a lot of times are two completely different things.
Fair enough.
And you have a hard time arguing that with somebody that's in the truth column in that sense. And they would tell you it's intellectual laziness that if you're drawing those conclusions, you're not looking at the specifics and the facts, that you're just going with how you feel. Well, on the flip side of that, somebody that does have a pretty good academic standing because they pursue things in the truth, but yet they do have a gift. You know what gifting is? This gifting are things that you kind of do naturally when you're pursuing the Lord.
Yeah.
And so Paul's that kind of segues in here.
Mm-hmm.
So he says, chapter 13, everybody calls it the love chapter, but there's a lot more in it than that. But he says in verse 1, he says, pursue love, yet desire earnestly spiritual gifts. Because remember now, he said spiritual gifts are all going to go away after all this is done. And then he made his point and made his foundation, and then he says, pursue love, yet desire earnestly spiritual gifts, but especially that you may prophesy. And so he starts speaking of tongues specifically here. He says, for one who speaks in tongues does not speak to men, but to God, for no one understands, but in his spirit he speaks mysteries. But one who prophesies speaks to men for edification and exhortation and consolation. One who speaks in a tongue edifies himself, but one who prophesies edifies the church. And so you got to stop there. And remember now, Paul is thinking eternally here. I was thinking about that this morning. He's trying to think eternally and lead people to come to a conclusion and that's the hard part. I think thinking eternally is something you do pursue, but I think the Spirit has to be involved in all that, and Paul knows that. That's why, like we've been talking about, it's like these guys talk about this stuff and they're trying to tell you like you can understand it, but if you're holding on to yourself, it's gonna be longer, but that journey is part of the sanctification thing. So with that off to the side, Paul tells them, make sure that your love in your heart is how you're pursuing things. And I think what was happening in the church, oh man, I've seen this in so many places. And it's not just with gifts specifically. But I think they were pursuing tongues because it looks like whatever it is you're babbling. I mean, the tongues that happened in Acts, I think, because there were so many different cultures and languages around there, that as they spoke in the tongues of fire that were going on, people were hearing in their own language the gospel that was going on.
Yeah. That's
not me just trying to rationalize what was happening. I'm just, because it says that they understood in their own language, and this guy's speaking Greek up here, literally.
Yeah.
And they could hear it in their own language. But he also speaks later on that if I'm speaking in tongues, Paul's saying, if I'm speaking in tongues, people that don't understand that language think I'm a barbarian. Now, I've lived in other parts of the world, right? And I'm a redneck. I barely speak English very well. But when people are talking to me in another language, even when I have some small grasp of that language, man, I feel like I am just out in the ozone somewhere.
Yep.
I feel lost. I feel intimidated.
Yep.
I feel all kinds of things like that. And the thing is, I finally learned they feel the same way when I'm speaking.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Paul's right.
Yeah.
So they were pursuing this gift of tongues because I think it made them feel like, when I'm going, God is looking at me and I'm looking at him and y'all should look at me in that respect. And after going back and looking at all the other chapters, that's another one of the things that I think they were pursuing. And he's telling them, Nothing wrong with tongues, but in itself, all you're doing there, even if you're doing it righteously, is not edifying the rest of the body.
Right. Well, and I think that's one of the patterns that we've tried to pull out of First Corinthians this entire time is,
Yeah.
I say it on repeat. I'll say it again today. Apologize. People approach First Corinthians as the law almost,
Yes.
in a sense of a checklist. And even in your pericopes, if you don't know what a pericope is, it's that little subheading on your sections in your chapters. There's going to be one in a little bit, and it says, it actually says, and those are not inspired. We put those in later. Order in church meetings. Now, that section does talk about order in church meetings. But
that's not really.
right. And it's one of those things that we want to try to help people do is to, yes, gather the surface level information that it's trying to give you. There's truths at the surface. But don't forget to back up and see what is also the encompassing message that Paul's bringing here. Remember, we started out with them being divided over who's right and who's wrong. Some of you follow Paul, some of you follow Apollos, and there was this big brouhaha. And I had this talk yesterday. There are ways to have conversations like that with people that you disagree with, and it's not divisive, it's edifying, and you don't have to agree when you're done.
Yeah.
Then there's a way to have talks like that, and it's really not profitable. And as what Paul's addressing here, I believe, because of the way he's addressing it through the chapter, they weren't having profitable, decent disagreements. They wwere really divided. There was really a problem.
And they were doing things to drive the division, whether they knew it or not.
Exactly. And on this topic, as we stated a while ago, it's always not even intentional. It just happens because as humans, we gravitate to people that are like us.
Well, I just think it should be like this. That's
Right.
where you've come to a place where you stopped. You don't know the answer, and you're not willing to pursue the answer. You're just really willing to go on how it is you think you want it to be. Again, that's what happens.
I was asserting in a conversation with a bunch of people yesterday that when we find ourselves saying things like, well, I think, or it makes sense that, or the logic would dictate, when we're doing an apologetic or we're doing a defense of or an explanation of what we would consider a Bible doctrine of the way things ought to be, and we're using language like what I think, and we can't go to here's how it is, we're on real shaky ground to be dogmatic. Now,
Yeah.
you can have a conviction, you can believe it goes a certain way, hoorah, all day long.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to be dogmatic with that and say this, thus, the word that I said is for a teacher of the word to say, thus saith the Lord, when the Lord did not thus say, is treacherous, treacherous ground.
Well, then I should never say anything if I don't know. No, because Paul even went,
I don't know.
let me tell you what I'm telling you here. That's not what the Lord told me. Here it is. Just quantify what it is you're coming from.
He spoke, he just qualified. That's exactly right. And so there's an element of that as we dig through here that Paul's doing. He spent the entire chapter 13 talking about the importance of love. I personally feel like, and you can tell it in some of the writings, we won't rehash it, but I think part of the problem that the Corinthians were having is they weren't loving it. They were too busy picking sides to love on each other.
Well, they were selfish.
Exactly.
I mean, it comes right down to it. We've talked about this 100 times. What God will not mess with in you is your ability to give up the right to yourself.
Right.
And that is not a one-time action. When you're saved, and that's a good, and you really are saved, and that, and I don't say that saying that you should find out if you're really saved or not. I mean, if your conversion, you got converted, that doesn't mean you've given up the right to yourself over everything that's down deep in there. Hence, the conversion starts. He's going to start pulling out every one of those little things, and it never stops in this life. So, yeah, I agree with you. They were loaded with themselves with worldly things. And remember, we talked about that their culture was 10 times more decadent than if you see our culture is decadent now.
Mm-hmm.
Way more than that.
Right.
And which is the other culture is eat up with just trying to figure out what life is based on where you're at. And these guys, they had the capacity to see the things of the kingdom in a way where they know there's something different, if nothing else.
Right. Right.
and they weren't responding too well. And so that's why Paul comes in. He knows they've been converted. There's realistic stuff going on here that he knows that they are kept people. Or I don't think he'd be having that conversation with
Well, and Tim uses that phrase a lot. They're kept people. And I think it's worth pausing a second and talking about what that means. Can you, in 1,000 words or less, explain what you... Okay,
just implied that I'm
me,
windy.
well, let me start at the other end and work back up towards being a kept people. A very limited explanation of what it means to be kept is somebody might say they're saved or they're not saved. Your ultra reformed person would say they're elect or they're not elect. Yeah. Okay? But I think a more biblical view, honestly, kingdom view to describe what's meant by a kept person is that God's working in them, moving in them with purpose, whether they're at the beginning, middle, end of the salvation process is kind of irrelevant to that term. Yeah. But the idea that they're kept is that they are family members. They're in God's, not even just in the family, but it's hard to articulate. Help me here a little bit.
Well, and as you've been saying, I wasn't really thinking in terms of that, but in terms of describing what that meant. So a kept person to me, that's language looking at it from how I think God looks at it. So it is a saved person, right? To me, talking about right here and in the New Testament times. But from God's perspective, a kept person is someone that I would tell you that he knows is saved, is going to be saved.
Right.
And how do I see that? Well, I can actually probably point to some scriptures, but we need to look at this in scriptural context from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Well, were those Old Testament people, were they saved or were they not saved? Well, I'm telling you, he was looking at them through Christ then, just like he looks at us as Christ right. on this side of that. Right. Because in his world,
he's not bound by
it
that.
It was already done.
Yeah, right.
And so, so where I'm sitting, I'm a kept individual. Why do I say that? Because I remember my salvation experience. And from that time on right there, not because it was some place on a time marker I can mark, but because he changed me right there, despite myself, despite all that. Call it, well, Tim, you're just telling me an emotional event or whatever it is. Well, you can take it however you want. I'm telling you that he revealed himself and I responded because I wanted that.
Well, and scripturally speaking, he recreated you. He made you a new creature.
And there's been a long journey since then. And the only reason that he dealt with me is because I was kept.
Right.
So when I say a kept individual, that's why I'm saying that Paul, we're looking at these Corinthians and going, you know, in our simple linear way of looking things, well, they're a bunch of heathens, you know. Inside we may know they're saved and all that, but what we won't reveal or say is, because looking at them do that, I got to make sure I make people think that I'm Mr. Kingdom guy too, because I know inside I look a whole lot like what they're doing.
Yeah.
So it's a revelation of, that's from the kingdom looking down on it. You have that capacity to see that. And Paul, well, he's dealing with them the way he is because he knows that they're kept people. Maybe are there some in there that are not saved? Probably.
Well, he's not punching them in the mouth like they're heathens. He's coaching them and training them like they're, we would call it, like they're saved people, because they are.
And in one hand, he's talking to them like they should know better. And on the other hand, he's talking to them through frustration because he wants them to be able to get it.
Yeah.
And so here we are. And he brings that into talking about, you guys keep pursuing these tongues and the tongues and the tongues.
Well, and I think 1 Corinthians 14, and I want to jump back into the text because
yeah,
I don't want to get lost in the weeds, but there is a lot of minutia and gray area in terms of how people perceive this sort of passage and the topics of the passage. And they want to draw, that is our nature, to draw these definitive lines. This is the way it is, this is the way it's not, because somehow it makes us feel empowered when we can say, this thus saith the Lord. Okay? But I want to encourage you, even in this chapter, this book, Paul we want to keep reminding you, there were times where Paul said, it's not what the Lord said. This is what I think. Now, the argument could be made. He was moved by the Holy Spirit, according to 2 Timothy, to say these things. And I agree with you.
I would agree with that.
However, we also have to deal with where we are right now. And so when you jump in, go ahead, you want to say something?
No.
When you jump into the text, chapter 13, love is fantastic, love is awesome, be loving. Okay, that's my summary of chapter 13. Please read more. In verse 14, the first thing he said, or chapter 14, pursue love. And in the Greek, I don't know the way David brought this out at church a couple months ago, is word order matters.
Yeah.
And if it's at the front of the verse in the Greek, it matters. It means it's carrying more weight and it's carrying more importance. He said, pursue love. I forget who said it. You may remember somebody that said one time, an old theologian, I don't remember who said it, but he said, love God and do whatever you want. Because if you love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, soul, and strength and all of that stuff, the only thing you're going to want to do is what he wants to do. So there's some safety there. That's a little trite, but he's kind of echoing that right here. Pursue love, but then he says, and desire spiritual gifts, and especially that you may prophesy. So maybe it's just because it's fresh on my mind, but because it's such a hotbed topic about whether or not gifts exist. We are in a New Testament church by a post-disciple area apostle, meaning that Paul is sometime after what we would kind of have considered that golden age. Jesus was here for 3 years. They're right after the resurrection. Some time has gone by, okay? So you've got these people outside of the confines of this original group. The church is beginning to grow. The church is beginning to bring in Gentiles, okay? And he's giving instruction to do something, to pursue spiritual gifts. One of the challenges that I have for people who say there are no such things is I'm going to say, then what do you do with 1 Corinthians 14:1? There is a biblical scriptural mandate to pursue something that you say no longer exists. And to try to squeeze a bunch of square pegs into some round holes to make it to fit what you've brought to the table instead of wrestling with and dealing with this text. And we have to do that. It's part of the growth process. And I honestly think that's part of what Paul's doing to them here. He's laying out some realities that they've just got to deal with.
Well, yes. I would say probably most people that are listening to us and in general context, I kind of fall into that third leg that you talked about earlier, because that's where we live now. People just, they don't know if they're there or not, so they don't really pay any mind. But when you read this, they're here.
Yeah.
The gifts are here. And so when he says pursue love, yet desire earnestly spiritual gifts, everything that Matt just said, I think is dead on. But if you're going, well, okay, if the gifts are here, the gifts are here. But some of you may be going, well, I really want to know what those gifts are. Good, go find out.
He says pursue them.
Pursue them. And if that makes you feel weird because you're afraid to tell people at church that you're reading about these gifts and stuff, you know what? There's probably going to be a 50-50 split. Some of them are going to think, oh, you're getting off into that weird stuff. And other people are going to be like, huh, okay, and not think anything else about it. So don't let that throw you off from pursuing, even if it's just knowledge of them, right?
Yeah.
But there is one thing I'll say here. So pursuing the gifts, and so it's almost like you can wish for one. That's a bad way to phrase it.
Desire, maybe a better word.
You could desire something specific because he tells them here, desire prophecy. But he says, the reason he says that is because the theme here is not about specific gifts.
Exactly.
It's about edifying the
body,
right? So here's the deal. If whatever gift you want to pursue or whatever your natural gift is that you may have no clue what it is, over time it may reveal itself, or people keep saying, man, I noticed you do this, this, and this. I mean that in a good way. That means you probably got some kind of gift. Now, if you want to label it, we talked about that sometime back.
Whatever.
I don't even care about that. But to be able to speak to you and say, well, I see this, this, and this in you. I don't want to put a name or a label on it, but again, our baser self is we look for that. And I would tell you, don't ignore it, but don't park there trying to figure that out unless that's something you think the Lord's leading you to do. But anyway, he says, the one who prophecy speaks to men, verse 3, for edification and exhortation and consolation. One who speaks in tongue edifies himself, and he doesn't mean that in a bad sense. That's his gift. And if somebody's speaking in tongues, he's talking to God, and maybe he doesn't even know what he's saying to God, because if the Spirit yearns for us in prayer and we have no clue what he's saying, I ask the Spirit to pray for things all the time that I don't know how to do it.
Well, and I think if you wanted to boil it down, what he's saying is you guys are pursuing a personally beneficial gift and ignoring the corporate benefit of this other gift.
And the bigger picture is he's been laying out the whole time, you're selfishly pursuing these things, which is why you have all this contention up in the middle of you.
Yeah.
So start fixing your focus different. He says in verse 5, now I wish that you all spoke in tongues, but even more than that, that you would prophesy. And greater is one who prophesies than one who speaks in tongues, unless he enter. So he says, in verse 6, he says, but now, brethren, if I come to you speaking in tongues, what will it profit you? So basically, they all go, ooh, Paul. So it'll like Moses going down to the temple when he starts speaking.
Yeah.
It says that they sit in the entrance of their tents and just, waiting for him to come out and say what God's going to do. And so Paul says, if I came and speaking to you in tongues, you may go, ooh, he's speaking to God. But he's telling them it would be absolutely useless for me to spread that all because you're not seeing the kingdom better than what it is.
Well, and there's within the debate about tongues or whatever, there is a sub debate, if you want to call it that, of are we talking about undistinguishable language, untie my bow tie, who stole my Honda, or are we talking about somebody who can supernaturally speak German or Latin or whatever? It's almost irrelevant to what he's saying, because if you were speaking some sort of alien language,
call it voices of the angels,
whatever
that means,
I wouldn't know the difference than if you were speaking some sort of a Portuguese dialect. I still am not going to understand what you're saying, and that's the point that he's making. He's not making a case that one is good in terms of real and one is not real. He's assuming. We call it a caveat. It is an assumed and accepted truth. Okay, that it's a real deal. But I can tell you right now. People have asked me, have you ever received the gift of tongue? The answer is, it depends. And I'm going to go on record. And they will say, well, what do you mean? I've never experienced what some people experience in what they would call speaking in tongues. However, there was a time before you and I started going to Mexico. I was in Mexico, and I was asked to give my testimony. And I know a little Spanish, a little. I know verb conjugation, how to conjugate a verb and how to structure sentences, but I don't have a lot of vocabulary, which if you don't have vocabulary, you can know the structure all day long. So I'm getting ready to give my testimony. One of the pastors, this was in Aguas Calientes, and he said, nobody here speaks English, and our translator doesn't speak very good English. And I'm like, well, then why are you calling him a translator? It'd be like me trying to translate Spanish for somebody.
Well, at the time, that's the translator they had.
It's all they had. Exactly right.
Been there a million times.
And so, but what happened was I said, all right, I'm just going to do my best. I prayed and I said, Lord, I remember a little Spanish. Help me get through my testimony in Spanish. And help me, just remember vocabulary. I spoke, 20, 30 minutes. And it was slow and methodical and intentional. But I basically preached an entire message in Spanish. And I'm telling you, words were coming. I knew how to put them out. I knew what to do. And I don't know. And I asked the guy later, I was like, did they get it? And it was great. Everybody understood what you were trying to say. I tried to do that again in Nicaragua. And it was a disaster. I was like, well, I did this once before. I can do this again. I grabbed the bullhorn from, what's her name? The translator with this young girl. I'm drawing a complete blank. Anyway, and I started doing it again, trying to speak in Spanish. She was like 14. She grabs the bullhorn from me. There's 300 people out there. She says, they don't know what you're saying. Just tell me. Because at that moment, there was no gifting for that. For whatever reason, he didn't give that to me at the time. I had to go through the translator. And so it wasn't like whatever. And so I read this text and I'm like, I understand now why he says this, because I just to be transparent, there was a little bit of, I did that.
Oh,
I preached in Spanish, man. You know, and it wasn't even arrogance or haughtiness. It was just like, man, that was awesome. I remembered my Spanish. But after that second time, which I was actually around more Spanish at the time, you would have thought that I would have remembered more. It literally could not happen, which told me that first time, it wasn't that I had a control of the language. God did something in that moment to help me communicate to these people the gospel.
But if God did that for you then, you would have been able to do it the next time.
That's what people say. That's not how they work, apparently.
When God's working something out in you, he does all kinds of things. It may seem like he's cruel and unjust and all that. This is a sidebar. And I've seen that, your story right there. I can't tell you how many times I have seen that exact same thing play out in other people. And I mean, you know, they had a little or something and they were able to do it. And then next time,
You can't.
nada.
Well, and that's a difference into, say, a gifting that you might have all the time.
And not only them doing it, watching a response that transpired out of it.
Yes.
That's how you know that the Lord's working and stuff like that.
Yeah. Because, I mean, I promise you, I felt like I'm using the wrong words. It's just awful. And as I'm looking out and people are starting to weep and they're crying and the gospel, and I'm like, he made a donkey talk one time. So I figured this is not that much of a stretch, right?
Not that big, that's not that much different, I don't think.
And it's exactly the same. Let's talk about prophecy for a second, and we'll try to land the planes. I know you got to go too, but
Actually, I'm good.
I've been in the ministry 30 years, just right at preaching, teaching, all the things, everything you could think of, I've done. There have been times that I know now I've stood to teach and to preach 100% in my own fleshly power. Okay?
Yep.
Didn't do my homework, didn't do my prayer cover, whatever. And for whatever reason, I'm not saying I was in backslid or anything. It just, I don't know, whatever.
Life.
Just life. And you know what? It was a put together. I know how to put together a speech. I was trained as a debater, did debate in college. I know how to take something complicated, break it down, put it into, I can do that. And it was just flat. There was no spirit. I mean, it was, if I was getting graded by my speech teacher, I'd have probably got an A. But
Well,
nothing.
the content might not even have been wrong.
Oh no, the content was fine.
Yeah.
But then there have been times where the Spirit gave me something, or I've taken the time to speak to Him and say, and it's changed my patterns of how I do things.
Yeah.
I can't stand to think about a pastor getting up, or a preacher or speaker getting up to speak in the pulpit without somebody or somebody's praying over them. One of the things that changed in me in that, on this idea of prophecy, when Tim and I started being around each other on a regular basis, he was the first one on a regular basis, about before I would get ready to get up to preach. Tim would come out at church and would come down, and I'd feel his arm come around my shoulder, and he would always pray for me before I start preaching. That changed my whole life in ministry, because I started noticing a difference in the preaching when we sought the Lord to gift the preaching, to speak through the spirit of prophecy, not just give a good sermon, but the Lord to actually speak through a word of prophecy, through the word that I'm reading and prepared, and work in the preparation, to work in the skill set, to let this. And then there's times I've gotten up to speak and given testimony, and it was blundered, and it was not ordered, and it was awful, but the Spirit was working in it.
Yes.
And there was a gift of prophecy that was in action, and people would come and get saved and be getting stuff sorted out and revealed to them.
Yes.
And I'm like, that's literally probably the worst sermon I've ever preached, but it was maybe the most impactful for that person, because it was done out of a gift of prophecy that the Lord at that moment chose to give. And to bring that back to the passage, the reason that's important is because in those times when the prophecy, when it's coming out for everybody got something.
Yeah.
And it amazes me when I teach and speak now. Same message. How many other people are there? Almost every time somebody gets something different.
Yeah.
You know, out of the same words or the same deal, because that's when you know the Spirit's actively doing it. Why is that such a big deal to me? If tongues are gone, so is prophecy.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
If the spiritual gifts have stopped,
The rapture has happened.
then then we no longer have the promise of the Spirit to work through us, and the promise that I'm going to preach a second, but the promise that Jesus gave us when he left, that it's better that he come when I go, because there's things he's going to do, empower you to do on a global basis, not just on a 12 basis, but everybody's going to get it. That was the significance of Acts 2 at Pentecost.
Yeah.
Everybody received it. That's why in the New Testament you see them, have you received the gift of the Holy Spirit yet? That's what they ask these people. You know?
In our vernacular, that'd be, are you saved?
Yeah. And, and so when I speak, it's always humbling to me. Because I know I could screw it up really bad in my flesh.
Yeah.
But it's also very encouraging because in the Spirit, I can't screw it up.
Yeah.
If a donkey can do it, surely I'm okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And
it does.
And what this does for me in 1 Corinthians 14 is not so much gives me a side to join, that they're still here or they're not. Because I don't know that that's the argument they were having, but they were having which gift should I get? It was more.
Yeah.
So,
I don't even know that. I think that they were pursuing, or the people that were somebody in the church, they were pursuing this gift or this tongue thing. Because I remember the stories were still around, what happened at Pentecost and all that kind of stuff.
it wasn't that long ago.
It wasn't that long ago, and I'm sure it was much more, well, I hate to say it that way, that it was much more prevalent. But I mean, and the whole point is the argument is not whether the tongues are real or they're not real. And I'm talking about us sitting here right now and in church over there. If you're wondering about the gifts, or you're at some academic level of talking about the gifts, there's a difference between just trying to identify gifts to know if they're there or they're not there, and pursuing the gifts, I think. Because in the end, pursuing the gift is finding out how God's going to work through you to edify the body. This isn't the only place that edifying the body is talking about. Even Jesus talked about it a lot. And Paul's whole point here is,
don't be selfish.
Well,
I'm sorry.
Practically speaking, he's saying if you're out here just babbling like an angel or whatever, it's like somebody picking up a flute and trying to play it, and
they don't know how.
You don't even know it's a flute.
Yeah.
My wife can pick up any instrument you can think of, and in 5 minutes she's playing a scale on it.
Yeah.
And you can go, ooh, that's a violin. Ooh, that's a piano. If I tried to do that,
it would sound like somebody was killing a cat.
Yeah, it would. And that's what he's saying. And so he uses that, oh man, I know we need to land this.
Yeah, we do. We'll come back to this, but yeah, we do have to land. But it's been.
We'll come back to the second half of all this.
Yeah, and I guess let me do some. We used to call this crystallization summary. If you're wrapped around the axle about whether or not gifts actually exist to this day, here's what I would ask you to do. Ask the Lord to show you. Don't rely at this juncture on what everybody else is telling you. Ask the Lord to do what he said he would do in John 17, which is to reveal Spirit, to reveal truth to you, and then sit down in chapter 14 and read the way that Paul speaks about these particular gifts and this particular one. And as an example, he's not talking about it in such a way that it is or it isn't.
Yeah.
There's a caveat that it is, and now he's talking about what good is it. and he's going to expand on it, because for him, the whole thing is we've got to edify the body. And as you read through the rest of it, we'll get back to it, he goes through this pretty significant, and I think it's significant enough to dig into maybe even verse by verse, of a breakdown of how a gift can be great for you, but it's not great for the body. But that this other gift of prophecy is good for everybody. And so it's almost like he's saying, you know what? Start with that one. Because he says in verse 18, I wish all of you spoke in tongues. I speak in tongues more than any of you. And he's going to say that later, but he's telling them almost, you're not there yet. You just start building people up first.
And so my add-on to that would be, if you don't know what your gift is or what gifts should be being done, don't sweat over it too much.
Yeah, don't sweat over it at all.
Just pursue your relationship with the Lord. And but if I'm a real Christian, I'm going to be pursuing these things. Take it easy and just pursue the Lord and let this stuff show up where it does.
Well, and I would encourage you to resist the urge to define what it looks like to be pursuing the Lord properly.
Oh yeah.
Because we don't know it. We do it all the time, and we don't do it on purpose. We bring ideas to the table of what we think pursuing God, being a mature Christian, and all these things is supposed to look like. And you get weird jets out of that. Well, you got to read this Bible. You got to dress this way. And that's what happens. I just want to tell you, seek the Lord's face. Ask him to reveal himself to you in whatever way he wants to when it's time for him to do it. And that's pursue the Lord, not the gifts of the Lord.
Yeah.
Pursue the gift giver, not the gift. And Paul will talk about that,
as he has earlier.
Yeah.
He's dropped in little hints about stuff like that. It's all about the perspective of where you're looking.
And I would even submit that if the gift itself is such a big thing to you, you may have lost perspective and sight of the gift giver. Yeah. And it would be good to just take a pause. We've got to land this plane. Thank you, everybody that was watching today. Hey, Charlie Wheeler said hi. He said to tell you hi. And I am going to shout out those who commented. We got Stephanie Powell has commented. Charlie Wheeler commented. Brett Bivens commented. I think Gail commented on one of the other streams that I can't see. But at any rate, guys, we appreciate you. Don't forget to go out to your favorite app store and download our app. All of our trainings in there. You can access Blue Letter Bible through there. Oh, speaking of Blue Letter Bible, just put this out there. On October the 31st, I got invited to come and share our ministry in a devotional, do a little speaking online via a national Zoom call with all of the staff of the Blue Letter Bible. And they do a monthly devotional meeting, or a monthly meeting, staff meeting, for all around remote meet. All their workers are all remote. I think it's in like 5 different states. And they bring somebody in and they talk about the app, and they talk about their mission. Then I'm gonna give a devotional. They've asked me to come in, and we're gonna be talking about the Crucible's Fire and how we use Blue Letter Bible. That's kind of cool. Be speaking at Mending Fences at Cross Brand in November. Tim's over at Canton Bible Church for the foreseeable future. So if you want to hear Tim preach and speak, you would be well served. That's at the Canton Bible Church if you don't have a place to go or to be. And he may not feel that way, but you'll be well served to hear about the kingdom there. Download the app if you ever want to pray about it, and the Lord leads you to support the ministry. You can do that through the app. You can do it online at thecruciblesfire.org. I actually think I might even have a website. I don't know. Maybe I do. You can also catch us on Spotify. We're on YouTube, but all of that is available through the app.
Yeah.
And if you just get the app on your phone and get that set up, you can also get our Bible study training videos are on the app as well. And we've got those set up for you. And I'm actually working on some stuff right now, a self-guided workbook to go through our training without having to attend one of the things. It's not ideal, but I've had quite a few requests for that I can't seem to make it to one of the trainings or to have one. It's only a couple times a year. I'm working on that now. I'm hoping to have that out by the end of the year. It's actually a lot of work.
Yeah.
It'll probably have around 40 small, short, 3 to 5 minute videos, maybe more than that, along with a workbook. And so it's gonna be neat when it's done. You guys, appreciate you. Love you guys. Talk to you later. Bye.